Wipe your nose if you get worried about time.
Oh, is this?
Yeah, just yeah. Right.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone, as you join us.
Good morning, Shet. How are you?
Hello, how are you?
Very well, thank you.
Very good. Glad you're here.
Some connectivity issues this morning. I was trying to join with a link and it kept saying the host has let you in. And anyway.
Yes, we
And
have
I'm
the
glad to be here.
technology. Hey!
Where was the host? Were you drinking coffee or taking a walk around the block?
Out at the park. We were talking about what a lovely day it is today.
Indeed.
So, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, Philomena.
So we have quite a few in the room. We're going to get started. Welcome everyone to our second equity brief. This is an effort to continue our action towards an equity frame leadership model for our region. We are fortunate to have a wonderful presenter today, Dr. Tanya Hampton, and we're fortunate to have Anika Ward, who is our facilitator. We're going to do something a little different because we want you to participate. So open up your chat. And as we get started, I would love for you to just say why you're here and what it is that you hope to get out of the day. So why did you join in and what do you hope to get out of the day? Again, I'm Shannon Lemon, Vice President of Economic Development for the St. Paul Area Chamber of Commerce. And this is a series continued in support by wonderful organizations. So we want to recognize our sponsors. Our presenting sponsor is Bremer Bank. Our venue sponsor, although we cannot be there, we're there in spirit, the Science Museum of Minnesota. We also have our program sponsor, which is the Bush Foundation, who is doing a lot in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And our corporate sponsors, Anderson, Anchor Paper, Flint Hill Resources, Land of Lakes, with a new logo, Mille Lacs Corporate Ventures, Redpath and Company, Travelers, Excel Energy. We also thank our contributing sponsors, Sunrise Banks, University of St. Thomas. So we are going to have a bite-sized discussion, rapid pace. We're going to lay a little foundation with Anika Ward. Dr. Tanya Hampton is going to set the context. And then via chat, we're going to have dialogue. So I want you to think about what you're hearing. What we want to walk away with is action. How are we going to lead in a time like this? And that's what this conversation is designed to do. We have just a few minutes on our clocks. So time check, if we look at it, we have about 42 minutes to get through everything. And 52 minutes. And so want to make sure that we can appreciate the rapid pace, but still absorb all the richness of the content that we're going to have. And without further ado, I turn it over to our illustrious moderator, Anika Ward. Yay, Anika.
Good morning. Thank you for that introduction, Shannon. I am thrilled to be here with everyone today and joining you all again for this important dialogue. We are a group of business and community leaders that are continuing to get together to have this conversation about our role and our responsibility for building systems, strengthening systems for equity and inclusion within our region. It is exciting to be back in this discussion yet again with you all. I appreciate St. Paul Area Chamber of Commerce and all of you for being a part of this discussion and continuing with these discussions with us. I want to bring us back to March. I want to continually do that to remind us that we came together for the series kickoff for the equity series, beginning with a discussion led by Lisa Jones around what is equity and why is it important to our businesses and our community leaders. And so we talked a little bit about leadership, the importance of leadership that is grounded in equity. And we talked about how important it is when you're a leader, when you're responsible for supporting an organization, leading people, start really in significant challenges, especially now And it's important that we understand those challenges, listen to people and experience those challenges, and then move to building a vision that's exciting and motivating and that gathers people and moves people forward towards action. So moving from the challenge to a vision and then moving in that vision with action. And there's a quote that I wanted to share by DeRay McKesson. And I think it's really, I appreciate the quote. It says, "I think about freedom as the absence, so the presence of justice and joy." And the reason that that quote is significant to me, especially in this conversation, is that we're not just thinking about the absence of inequities, we're thinking about presence of something that moves all of us and improves the lives of our community. So when we talked about disparities, Lissa in March talked about the fact that the disparities that we're experiencing in our communities and across our country that can be seen so clearly by all at this point were designed and deliberately baked into the foundation of our culture, of our systems in our country. Laws, practices, and policies, including redlining and segregation, were baked into the social institutions that we rely on and that produce the outcomes that we're receiving. And so as leaders, as equity-centered leaders, it's our role, it's our responsibility to understand that, to know that, and then to intentionally start to pull apart some of those things that were baked in for inequities and start to rebuild our systems intentionally and deliberately for equity. So immediately after that March meeting, the world changed. You know, in March, we were bumping elbows instead of shaking hands. But right after that, everything started to change. And so SPAC, St. Paul Area Chamber, started to think about how to continually be responsive and to create and reshape these conversations, even though we meet in person, and what we're here today on time now for these equity briefs. On April 8th, we remember talking about the 4 frames of leadership, and Lissa Jones brought that back to us and shared with us how structural, human resources, political, and symbolic leadership are all important at this time. So today, we're moving to a conversation that's really important, especially during this time, and it's about knowing fear. So the conversation is Know Fear, K-N-O-W, fear. And this discussion will be about recognizing and listening to those worries, those fears, those concerns that we have inside of us and that others around us within our businesses, our institutions, and our communities are bringing forward, and leveraging that sensitivity as wisdom as to kind of move us forward in a really intentional way. I'm excited and thrilled to bring and to introduce Dr. Tanya Jackman-Hampton to you. As one of her early diversity, inclusion, and equity influences, Tanya Jackman-Hampton comes from a long family legacy of equity in media through the Minnesota Spokesman Recorder. She is also a thought leader, knowledgeable in leadership development, change management, and emotional intelligence, helping leaders to be vulnerable and trust their fears while achieving their personal and organizational goals. And Dr. Hampton, we're thrilled to have you this morning.
Thank you, Anika. This is wonderful to be here, and my very first keynote sort of webinar with all of you, and I'm super thrilled to be in your attendance and certainly partnering with you as we have a conversation around equity and think about how our own fears for other people might impact our leadership and our ability to really influence how we approach equity. And instead, what I'd like to couple with those fears that we generally have in life when things like a pandemic or a circumstance might bring about for us, we might be scared and we might be worried. And I'd like to invite a conversation around how can you think about no fear in the way that we weren't always hardwired to think about it as, and think about how you can get to know your fear, which is why it's intentionally named No Fear, and really utilize that as an opportunity-based leadership conversation today. So before I get started, I just want to say hello. I know I've got some folks that are there that I don't know and some folks that I do know. Particularly want to call attention to, I saw that one of my Soras is on the line, so I'm super thrilled that she's there. Ms. Sarah Demis-Stockman is there, so hello to you. And of course, some of my colleagues from Twin City Diversity Inclusion Roundtable, Philomena and Colette, thank you so much for being there. And I'm also thrilled to be in participation with all of you as we have this conversation. So let's get started. If we just shift over, I want to start with a quote, that is really important to me as we think about our own security. And Helen Keller, I think, said it best. She said, "Security is mostly a superstition. It does not exist in nature, nor do the children of a person as a whole experience it. Avoiding danger is no safer in the long run than outright exposure. Life is either a daring, learning adventure or nothing." And, you know, when you think about Helen, she had some of her own personal challenges that, as I think about them, create my own fears if I were a person with disability of not being able to hear or see, right, let alone trying to deal with issues of equity. And so I like to listen to Helen because she brings forth a perspective that says that security is really superstition. And so while we hear in life that leaders are fearless, today's conversation is about understanding what your fears are so that you can utilize that information as a means to moving forward. And so much of what we might know about fear is that it tries to keep us safe. Well, the reality is that safety isn't always present. And so we need to work through some of the challenging situations like we are experiencing today, or even in the last several weeks with the pandemic. So moving forward onto the next slide, our overview for today is fear really can be one of those things that we know to immobilize us, but really I'd like to say it motivates us. And if we let it, more often it can immobilize us and lead us to making decisions solely based on the perceived level of risk. Yet, the deliberate thinking and risk-taking is vital in every aspect of business, particularly in the area of addressing inequities and disparities. Move on to the next slide. And so in our conversation, we will discover why knowing fear is critical as an element for being focused on opportunity-based leadership. And we will engage in how to identify, explore our fears, doubts, or worries, learn a positive strategy, and equip ourselves to really further neglect inequities and systemic racism, especially while we're engaged in social distancing and a pandemic. I want to start off as a part of our conversation, really saying what leadership is for me or what leaders do. And leaders who know their fears, connect with their fears, and establish a positive response strategies, improve their relationship with fears and their leadership abilities. So the more that you are in tune with your own emotions or emotional intelligence awareness that you establish, the more likely you are able to navigate difficult situations. Move on to the next slide. So one of the things I want to prompt as our conversation is, why don't we take risks? And I would encourage you to, at this moment, put those comments in the chat box and answer, why don't we take risks? Why is risk something that we tend to try to avoid? Fear of the unknown, fear of failure, and insecurity. We want to be perfect. Oh, so true. Fear of failing, uncertainty comes with consequences. Fear of unknown outcomes. Absolutely. These are all things that I've heard before. And what came out of what I haven't mentioned yet is research that I did some time ago, and now I'm writing a book about, in terms of how we react to our fears and what generally is something that we do when a risk comes about. And every one of you have made comments that are very relevant to our conversation. You might be wondering, why are we having this conversation as we think about inequity and disparities? Well, frankly, as practitioners or individuals in the diversity inclusion field trying to address disparities and inequities, we don't spend enough time on ourselves sometimes to really get at our own concerns. And so I'm glad that you all are being vulnerable and sharing some of the fears that you've heard of, or even what might be your own personal fears as you think about what exists within you. And those are certainly, I'm sure, coming to the forefront as you are dealing with the inequities and disparity issues that already exist or even have really expanded since the pandemic and the circumstances resulting from social distancing. All right, I'm going to move us on to the next slide and actually underscore what you have highlighted to be why are the reasons that we tend to avoid risk. And what showed up in research that I did about 4 years ago was leaders really said, hey, failure is a reason why I don't deal with risk, and fear of non-achievement. And these are the fears where I think about the outcome itself is going to be something where I will not achieve the desired results. Another reason is distrust, fear of loss of credibility. These fears are based on the losing credibility of organizational support and not being uninspiring, especially during presentations, right? So that might even be on my mind, or it might have been on other people's minds when you've delivered a presentation. Fear of uncertainty, which can include these fears show up where interacting with others in challenging situations, problems, or unfamiliar experiences. And then fear of losing integrity, power, or influence. And these fears are centered around not wanting to be involved in activities that challenges one's ability to influence others. We all have a sense across all of these different categories of not wanting to lose whatever might be in front of us if it results to us being a failure, distrust, uncertainty, or impact. And so those themes, categories came up in the comments that you provided, and you're absolutely accurate as we look at what other fears leaders might have themselves. So one of the things I want to bring some insight into is, guess what? We encounter situations every single day that bring about risk. So if we go on to the next slide, if you think about it, if you were sitting on a perch of a sort of a rock that had a cliff, and you were looking over the site, there's actually some risk in sitting there, right? If you were to fall, something could happen. But some of us do things like this to get leisure, to get pleasure, to get enjoyment. And so there is some reward, and that's why we do it. Similarly, when we go to sleep, what we don't know is, frankly, we may or may not wake up. And so there's some risk in going to sleep. There's risk in eating. We can eat something that's bad for ourselves. There's risk in working out, and particularly now that we are all probably working out at home or doing our best anyways. There is certainly risk in interactions with other people, especially now, and that's what these last two photos are. My point is that every single day, basic situations or situations as drastic as what we are experiencing today with the virus bring about risk. And as leaders, we need to be willing to understand what are the fears that surface as a result of these circumstances and still react or be a part of change within our organizations. So what I'd like to do is try to equip you with a tool that you can utilize to do that. So if you want to go on to the next slide. And part of the tool is based in, I would say, opportunity-based leadership, where we are accepting that the problems are inevitable. We still yourself to first impression. So like you try to not lock on to that first impression and consider what else might be part of the alternative. You distance yourself from the problem, you learn to objectively evaluate the threats and consequences, and you ignore reactions, focus on improvements. Go on to the next slide. So the tool is, one, think about how you can engage in your fear, which is shift your negative self-talk that you might otherwise have to positive self-talk and encourage yourself to move on, regardless of what the risk is, and step into it to try to take on the challenge. You also want to understand, where did that fear come from? And consider having conversations with others, like really sharing what your own fears are, hearing what their fears are, and perhaps if they have the same fear, learning from them how they responded differently. And then finally, execute, meaning after you've looked at other ways that someone else might solve a problem or how you have solved a problem in the past, when you had a similar fear, leverage that information to create your plan, visualize positive outcomes, and then act. It's that simple. It's thinking about how you can engage, explore, and execute, which frankly is literally the opposite from flight, freeze, or fright. So it's important to think about the hardwiring that we've had in the past, whether it's been influenced by society or what we know to be true about our automatic part of the brain that tends to flight, fright, or freeze. It's really trying to shift your thinking to the deliberate part of your brain and instead engage, explore, and execute. You want to move on to the next slide? So I'll end by saying, through Nelson Mandela, who I think is one of the people that says a comment about fear the best, I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. The brave person is not the one who does not feel afraid, but the one who conquers that fear. So what we'd like to do now is shift it back to Anika, and we're going to have sort of a moderated dialogue around some of your own fears specific to what we're experiencing today in terms of the social distancing and the pandemic.
Thank you so much, Tanya. Dr. Hampton, we appreciate that introduction to this discussion. And I invite all of you to post questions as you begin to have questions, because we'll start then with the questions that Tanya has posted here. And then as you have questions for Dr. Hampton, I would invite you to write them in the chat, and then we'll look through the questions and make sure that we spend about 10 minutes after our dialogue asking some questions of Dr. Hampton. So her first,
we have some moderators or facilitators that are helping us. So it may take a team as things are posted that we can capture them. So if you could just look as questions are being posted and make sure you help capture those so we can get back to them, that would be great. Those of you that are helping.
Oh, fantastic. We've got moderators that'll pop in with the questions.
Yes, they're gonna help capture the questions as we roll through in case we miss them in the chat.
Okay, perfect. So I very much appreciate the conversation Dr. Hampton just presented us. One, to talk about the fact as we're discussing this concept of leadership, the fact that there is no position that you can take that is not a risk. And so as we're thinking about all the different positions, whether we choose to act in a bold way, whether we choose to sit back, whether we choose to wait and learn more, there are risks associated with whatever we choose to do or not do. And that's a really important, for me, that's a really important fact. And listen to present and discuss. One, can you share anything that stood out or resonated for you? We'd like to really begin a conversation amongst each other. And specifically, if you have fears that you want to share about the social distancing that's happening right now and with the pandemic and what's happening within your businesses, please chime in.
And if it helps, I can just start us off too, as it relates to this first question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
great. So, one of the things that I would highlight just slightly is I actually work at Cook Ross, and while I've presented to you content that is coming from my own research and not connected to Cook Ross, you all know, and if you don't, you quickly learning here that it's an organization that's focused on diversity inclusion through organizational development principles. And one of the things that we've done as an organization is that we've really shifted our experiences going from being in-person facilitated sessions, whether it's a training session or a facilitated strategy session, helping organizations to create their diversity inclusion strategic plan. We have instead moved our work virtually and literally had to go through a process over 35 to 40 days to put together modules. And yesterday I even had my first live strategy session with an organization that is fully committed to diversity inclusion to help them create their strategic plan around IDEA, is what we call it, which is inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. So what jazzes me is, while I personally at home and just so exhausted, quite frankly, from being at home, I am an extrovert. I love to be outside. I realize that one of the things that I do to drain my own energy, to not think about what's going on in my head so much, is to actually go out and go shopping, or to hang out and do something that, requires me to see people or run errands. And so while I've got those thoughts, I also have my own business thoughts about how are we going to get the work done. We used to be in person with employees that worked for other organizations to help them with their work. And we were perplexed about how we could do that. But it's wonderful to see that we were able to shift our business model and come up with different products. And so I'm hopeful that some of you are feeling that same way and have some of your own stories. I'm going to see what comes up for you, and just be quiet and see what comes up. I see Shannon has something here, which is one fear is adding to the inequities based on the decisions we have to make to manage operations like staff cutting, remote technology, who's on the front line for service, etc. Absolutely. What else?
Anya, this is Philomena.
Hello.
Hello. I was just going to talk about, one of the fears that's happening in our country is geared towards the Asian community. And a lot of things, microaggressions to macro. And so one of the things that we've been doing at Land O'Lakes is education and talking about it. And we're going to have a discussion next week. Our Asian Affinity Group is going to lead that discussion to create awareness of what's happening. And then what can we do as bystanders when we hear things that happen towards we're out shopping or in our neighborhood or whatever. So I think it's kind of a combination of education and discussion as well, because there's so many impacts that are happening as a result of COVID that maybe existed but are being escalated.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And with the story that you shared, you addressed both questions, which is absolutely very helpful, getting people to think about, what are the strategies and steps that you can take, even given the concerns that you might have. Similarly, some stories I've heard in the Asian community have been very frightening. And the way that people are responding to Asians in different countries or even here is frightening. And to see an organization like Land O'Lakes having a conversation about how to address it and be open about those challenges, but then respond is absolutely a great, best, and proven practice. Thank you for sharing that.
This is Colette. Maybe just to piggyback on that, I just think, in response to the question, what fears do you have about social distancing and pandemic? I think it's also the fear of the unknown. For all of us, we don't know when we're going back to whatever next, normal is. And I think within that, that's my own personal fear, but I see that in our environment. Recently, the president just declared that all immigration was being stopped. So kind of, going on to this idea of others, myself and others. And so when fear of unknown and fear of uncertainty of future, I think we just gravitate to taking care of ourselves and being really individualistic. And so in the reactions that are occurring about, again, the us and them, I'm just really seeing that, and in terms of just some of the decisions that are being made that I think speak to just, again, the how do I take care of myself, me and myself, and my, and my people, and afraid of the other. So I'm really concerned about that. I don't know what that I've just been seeing it in small things, but I'm afraid that might escalate and get bigger. So
yes. Thank you, Colette. And that is so real. And one of the things I've thought about is related to what you said, and that when we come out of this, there's going to be sort of this PTSD that's going on for all of us, right? Where we have been traumatized and we don't know what to do. And there was actually a comment in the chat about it's difficult to really realize where we're at, and that the sharing even vulnerability in situations where we don't trust or we can't see people is difficult. So that's coming up too, as it relates to the fears that we have, whether it's about being fears of unknown or fears of not being able to interact. Those types of emotions are impacting us and creating trauma along with the pandemic and the social distancing. And so it can naturally escalate how we respond to other people. It can naturally escalate how we respond to issues. And we really are going to need our own tools or tools like the one that we've talked about today to help us to be able to take action. But at the same token, be honest with yourself, right? So what support do you need within your organization once you are able to come back together? Or even if you aren't, what conversations can you have? And then even on a personal level, what help might you need or support do you need through other people or through other systems and mechanisms to motivate yourself? Lots of stuff coming up in the chat. I'm not sure if I'm keeping track, or Anita, if you want to take it from there and see it. Can you follow the
Morning, Tanya. Hi, it's Adrielle. How are you?
Hi.
Hello, everyone.
I didn't see you there. That's wonderful. See you
I
there.
just showed up. Hey, I just wanted to acknowledge my fellow educator, Rita, for talking about what's going on with institutions, and I'm assuming this is an education institution with student populations. I work at Minnesota State Colleges and Universities at the System Office in the Office of Equity and Inclusion, and I just want to acknowledge exactly what is being discussed, and the things that we're also hearing about the fragility of the connections, as Rita so eloquently put it, about that loss that's happening with a lot of our student populations, particularly our student populations that are in economic fragility or are underrepresented. I think there's concern on campuses. Now that they're off campuses, how does that translate into walking around with the community? So there's layers of discussions that are happening, and we've been actually producing some webinars directed to our folks around these issues around equity in distance learning, or the inequities that are occurring there, the inequities that are occurring, and I think you mentioned it very well about the racism and the xenophobia, how that's affecting our populations. In the course rooms, we're seeing the Zoom bombs. People don't say that as much, but most of those have racist comments, have lewd sexual comments, and we are in a very fragile situation of how to even just get through this semester. Has been, all hands on deck. People have really been doing their best. So I appreciate the comment from my fellow educator about the need for us to kind of come together, if not, in some way virtually, just to make sure, those that have students in the K-12, in the post-secondary space, know that there are resources for them to support them during this time.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you very much. Very, very much hitting on the comments earlier that Rita posted in the chat, as well as what institutions are doing. And I appreciate the comments, and I'm thinking that there are probably some of your other peers that are here too, that are learning and taking advantage of the suggestions that have been offered.
Dr. Hampton, this is Anika Ward. I am, Rita also posted a little bit about worrying about the increasing inequities because things are getting so tough and it might be difficult to recover back to where we even have been. I have a question for you, Dr. Hampton, because at this point, one of the worries that I have, I'm hearing from some leaders that there's going to be less enthusiasm, even though on one hand we're hearing and we're being kind of slapped in the face with the fact that these inequities that we've been accepting all over the country are now coming back to haunt all of us, and we have to do something about it. At the same time, there's leaders who are saying, I'm going to have to really focus and double down on making a profit. And the conversation about equity and inclusion that I've been a part of, I've heard this from some leaders. The conversations about equity and inclusion kind of have to hold for a minute while I work to revive the organization. So I'm worried that I'm wondering how much that might be taking hold, and how much what you're seeing in terms of the leaders that you're speaking with and communicating with.
Absolutely. Thank you. And those conversations have come up. And the advice I would offer is a couple things. One is inclusion has never been more important than now, if you will. People are working remote and they're working from their homes, and they're excluded from one another more than they have been in the past. And that in and of itself creates an opportunity for inclusion and some very active behavior to make sure that people do have a sense of belonging. A second thing I would say is that the interactions that we have with one another become more complex when we are working remote. And so difficult conversations come about, or diversity gets a little bit buried in terms of our interactions, because we have more people who are challenged by the fact that they can't see people. And sometimes in those situations, it creates an interest of wanting to be a little bit more bolder. And what I call it is, authenticity being trumped by integrity, and people not being kind and utilizing sort of this notion of being invisible. So when we talk about the Zoom bombs and people flying in and making inappropriate comments, frankly, I think that they're doing that because they have the ability to do so and no one can see them. And so unfortunately, when those situations come about, obviously it's going to impact employees that are on that call, and there's a necessity to really address that issue and the impact that it has, and have a difficult conversation to talk about the diversity issue that has just been brought about by someone coming in and laying a Zoom bomb, or just someone saying a comment that's inappropriate during a conference call. That can happen. I've had situations where I've heard people have comments about their appearance in the room that they're in when they're on the call, or the way that they look even on the WebEx. And so those are different types of situations that have come about that we haven't experienced while we're in the workplace. Certainly there's probably some similar things that we can utilize to address them, but they're new conversations that we do need to have, and be mindful of what new diversity is in the space, whether it's visible or invisible. And so that is to my argument, or my thought about diversity and inclusion being an important conversation more than ever before today.
One of the things I'd like to add too, I'm looking at Brooklyn's comment about the elderly. There was this conversation, can we just lump all diverse segments together and talk about equity and diversity among all groups? And the need really to look at the unique segments, the unique groups and populations and needs in order to address it. And I think it really is important when we talk about generational inequities, and how it seems to be easy to kind of put our elders aside, or have less expectation for older people. But hopefully this situation, where so many are so vulnerable in the care situation, of how important great care is, and how important that we continue to keep them as an integral part of our society and interacting with them. And just the risk of isolation and bad care, as Brooke is pointing out. So I think, to be deliberate, yes, it is complex. It's easier not to focus on this when we're trying to recover profit. But as you're saying, the need is even drill deeper and look at our segments and our populations and the needs within our people groups in order to have a stronger community, and to really harvest the value that individuals bring and can contribute to our society.
Absolutely.
Tanya, I'm seeing some comments come in through the chat about mental health, well-being, anxiety, fatigue, and then this whole re-entry, when we do re-enter the workplace. So would you be able to talk a little bit about some of those elements and how they are impacted, or strategies that we might be thinking about as we plan the re-entry into the workplace?
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, re-entry into the workplace is going to be different, because we're going to see even some caution, right? And people are not going to want to come to work even when they are invited to come back to work. And so that presents a new dynamic. And then even when they're in work, we're going to be looking at people very differently. You know, there are talks about people going back to work with wearing masks, and talks about people going back to work and needing to be tested. And so there's still a little bit of unknown, and actually more than a little bit of unknown, but a lot of unknown about how people are going to need to prepare to go back to work. As it relates to the work that we do, we have to keep, you know, up our pace, quite frankly, and be thinking about what if these situations come up, what can we do as diversity inclusion practitioners, folks in the field, in responding to these issues. And just like we've done before in the past, being present is essential, and being aware of opportunities for having conversations, bringing people together to hear them, rather than avoiding those situations. You know, if we think about some of the circumstances that came up with Black Lives Matter, or when we started to have more conversations in our organizations about race, this, I think, could be similar, where we need to still address it point on, as opposed to not wanting to have the conversation. And so that's what I would encourage, is initiating it, hearing about what other people need, and seeing solutions come from others rather than just yourself, and have collaboration occur more than you might have had it occur in the past. And be willing to have multiple different champions in your organization to really champion the efforts and start to implement them as well. Those would be suggestions I would offer. I'm curious if there are others on the line that would add. Thank you, Philomena.
Maybe just one additional add, Tanya, about kind of the mental health and anxiety is, I think, the acknowledgement that it is happening in our organizations. And our CEO does a weekly chat, and she talks about her own experience with her family, and then she translates that to what employees in the organization are feeling. And so I think, like, humanizing that, I think, is really important, in the acknowledgement, and then providing resources. So what does that look like? What are resources to be able to help, and continue to communicate those resources in multiple ways, I think is really important. So our employees and our communities feel supported.
Absolutely. Another thing that comes up for me is, you know, we're really, really good at responding to people who say that they are sick and they need a PTO day. And we should provide space for individuals who say they need a mental health day, and be okay with that, and not in turn say that, you know, they can't handle the stress or they can't handle the distress, and give them that PTO, that opportunity to be away from work, to take a well-being day and a break, and be able to really ground themselves, so that they are not perhaps having as much concern or whatever might be causing their mental health challenge, and just be open to those types of conversations and supportive.
And I'd like to add to that to say that we need to practice and model that as leaders. I know, I think sometimes for myself, you know, I want to show up and I need to keep going. And I've just taken on an initiative at Bremer that I'm going to kind of take over the well-being portion so that we can do that. But I took it because I'm not good at it right now. And I thought, if I take this and I lead this initiative, I must do it. And so the, 5 weeks, I took a day off on Friday, and in 2 more weeks, I'm taking another day off on Monday. But it's like, I think as leaders, we want to show up, and we know we care about this. That's why we're all here in this space together today. But I know for myself, I have to start doing this. And so in order to lead in this way, I've got to do this. So for those of you that are here today, I want that's my challenge. How many of you are taking that time to take care of yourself as you're leading people? So
that's right. Thank you, Colette.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Colette. I also would just share a little bit from my personal experience being in leadership spaces. I am not an extrovert, but I show up, and people seem to think of me as an extrovert. extrovert. I'm very much not. And it's been interesting through my career, finding myself in leadership, thinking about how to care for myself as I move through different spaces, and when I'm asked to do different things that might push me out of my comfort zone, or when I'm considering different options and recognizing this one option is probably the right thing to do, but it's the most scary one. I think sometimes from the thing that I have found that works for me really well as an antidote for the kind of flight, freeze, fright response is, rather than setting my sights on what external perspectives of success would look like if I do a good job at this thing, or if I do the right thing here, I am trying to constantly remind myself to set my sights on a clarity of knowing who I am, create like clarity of what my values are and what my vision for where I'm going and who I'm becoming is. And then if I step out and show up in spaces, if I make mistakes, I have to continue to remind myself to keep my sights on whether I'm living into that vision and those values and that person that I'm becoming, that I expect myself to be. And that helps me kind of soften the fear or the worry about if I do something wrong, and helps me live into the leadership vision that I have for myself. So I don't know I hope that's helpful for other people, but there's a process for me of reminding myself of who I am as a person and what that means about who I am as a leader, and clarifying my values and trying to always live within them. So that way, especially during these times, I will make mistakes. We will make mistakes, especially when we're in a leadership position. And so when I make the mistakes, it helps me to be more confident that I am still doing the right thing. I'm moving in the right direction.
That's really good. And what that brings up for me, Anika, is another favorite quote of mine. I don't have it fully memorized, but President Obama, when he was in his tenure, had mentioned this notion of we don't always think about the word excellence, and we actually need to spend more time thinking about it and how we actually show up that way. And the reality is that none of us are perfect, and we are perfectly imperfect, and excellence is allowing us to think about how we might make that mistake, tweak it, and then show up again slightly different based off our learnings. And that's how we become better and how we are becoming excellent individuals. Yeah, absolutely. Melanie is mentioning giving ourselves and each other grace is so important now and always, and giving ourselves and each other grace is so important. I think you referenced it twice. Thank you very much for doing that. It's true. You know, when we think about webinars, we actually provide a little bit more space to have some error than we might when we are showing up in person. And I would like to offer that maybe we need to, consider how we give each other grace on webinars or on conversations like this when we get back into our in-person situations, because we seem to, at least in my experience, give each other a little bit more space when technology is not quite going right, or when there's a presentation that won't quite go up right away. Everybody waits patiently and is supportive. And those are the types of behaviors and actions we should offer up into the workspace when we return.
That is so helpful, very helpful. So I'm wondering if, as we reorient ourselves with our last few minutes here, if there are any questions about how we could put this into action, particularly for you, Dr. Hampton or Anika. How will we take this and use it? And then Anika is going to wrap us up for the 9:30 stop.
Yeah, I'd like to offer up a really quick story. When I first took my very first diversity, inclusion, leadership role, leading a national organization on this topic, I realized that, what I've been told for so long, that, it doesn't matter if people don't like you, actually is true. It does matter. And it's important that you are able to influence people's perspective. Mm. And so one of the things that I did is I came up with a lid lifter, is what I call it, where I like to flip my frame. So instead of saying, I can't do this, I can do this, as an example. That wasn't the one I came up with. But in order to interact with people that I felt maybe didn't like me or didn't like the message I was trying to convey, or the strategy that I was trying to implement. Sometimes in the past, that might have been something I would have avoided. And so I came up what I call, like I said, a lid lifter of my newly really informed perspective. And that is not is everyone going to like you. And that's why I called it newly, because not everyone is going to like you as a concept. And that was a message, my walk-on song that I played in my head for me to be able to move forward and still offer up the strategy. So that's one action I'd suggest as you think about engage, explore, and execute. That's a tool, absolutely. And consider a reframe for those situations that you might encounter that you might otherwise have avoided in the past.
Thank you for sharing that. And I want to thank everyone for this discussion. Dr. Hampton, thank you so much for sharing this research that you've got and giving us the time with you to talk through this. I also want to thank the facilitators who have been on the call and who have been watching. It's so hard to watch all the questions. So for catching all those questions and important points that people are making and bringing them up today. Someone just on the chat asked to show or send the 4 frames of fear that you had discussed. There was a slide. And so I'm not sure if we can get that out, but somehow I'd like to share that with folks. The one thing I want to just kind of close on is this reminder that fear is important. Dr. Hampton shared that with us. And for me, fear reminds me not to stay foolishly comfortable, to be respectful of possible pitfalls, to understand that failure and disappointment and hurt is a real and possible outcome. Fear is an important indicator for me that something needs to change, I need to pay attention to something, and it's a motivator. And that's what we want. When Shannon said we want to move to action, fear is the motivator. It lets us know that we need to move and act with intentionality and with deliberateness. And that's what we're here for today. The challenge is for all of us is to think about, to understand the challenge, understand our fear, understand what we're feeling and what other people are feeling, accept that, and move forward into a stronger vision with purpose and with that sensitivity. So thank you all for being with us today. Shannon, I'm not sure if you want to pop on just to close, but it's been wonderful having this discussion and we appreciate you all.
I want to say thank you too, Shannon. Really appreciate being here, and thank you, Anika. We can't hear you.
Sorry about that. Appreciate you, Dr. Hampton, and everything that you brought. This time is not nearly enough to unpack all of your great wisdom. I think that we should have a big book signing party once you get that book done, and hopefully we can do a little more than elbow and stand 10 or 6 feet apart, but looking forward to that work and bringing to light all of your great research and practice so that we can learn some more. Anika, thank you again. What I would ask for everyone as we conclude is to just share in the comment section or chat room topics that you would like to hear, presenters that you would recommend. Our next session will be on May 6th, and then we will come back on May 22nd. And our hope is the equity series will be live in June, but we don't know. So we'll keep you posted. But just thank you, all of you. Post comments as we close out, and hoping that you have a fearless day, or as you lean into your fear, you can overcome. Thank you all. And
Thank you.
congratulations to everyone for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good day, everyone.
Bye-bye.